The early morning air was crisp in Jasper National Park, each breath forming a small cloud in the frosty chill. Park Ranger Jake Calloway sipped his steaming coffee, staring out over the vast pine forest that seemed to stretch endlessly. His radio crackled to life, jolting him from his thoughts.
"Jake, we've got a report of a missing father and daughter,"
came the voice of dispatch.
"Campground 12 near Medicine Lake. Their campsite's abandoned. No sign of them. Over."
Jake frowned and set his mug down.
"Roger that. I'll head there now. Over and out."
As he slipped into his truck, the unease began creeping in. It wasn't uncommon for hikers to wander off the trail or lose track of time, but something about the way the dispatch had phrased it felt wrong. Shaking off the feeling, Jake revved the engine and headed toward the site, gravel crunching beneath the tires. Campsite at Campground 12 was eerily silent when Jake arrived. No birds sang, no wind rustled the trees. Just stillness. The tent stood in perfect condition, but there were no signs of activity. A small campfire pit sat cold, its charred logs arranged neatly as though ready to be lit. Jake stepped out of his truck, the sound of his boots crunching on the frosty ground, loud in the unnatural quiet. "Hello," he called, his voice echoing in the emptiness. "Ranger Calloway, is anyone here?" No response. He moved closer to the tent, crouching to peek inside. 2 sleeping bags were laid out, one adult-sized, one child-sized. A stuffed rabbit lay discarded on the floor. Jake's stomach tightened. Nearby, he noticed a trail of footprints leading into the woods. One set large, one small. A sinking feeling weighed him down as he grabbed his radio.
"Dispatch, this is Calloway. I've got tracks leading into the forest. I'm following them. Over. Copy that, Jake. Be careful out there. Over."
The tracks meandered through the dense forest, twisting and turning, as though the pair had been wandering aimlessly. Jake followed them for nearly an hour, the trees growing thicker and the light dimmer as the morning wore on. The unease that had been gnawing at him earlier had now grown into a full-blown sense of dread. Something was wrong. The tracks suddenly stopped. Jake crouched, scanning the forest floor. The prints ended abruptly in a patch of disturbed earth, as if the two had been lifted. He shuddered at the thought, rising to his feet and surveying the area. The forest seemed darker now, the tall pines casting long shadows. The silence was oppressive. Not even the usual rustle of squirrels or the distant call of birds could be heard. It was as if the forest was holding its breath. A low growl broke the silence. Jake froze, his hand instinctively reaching for the handgun at his hip. He scanned the tree line, heart pounding in his chest. "Who's there?" he called out, trying to keep his voice steady. No response, just the sound of his own breathing. And then he saw them. 2 glowing red eyes, watching him from the shadows. Jake took a step back, his breath hitching. The eyes were unnaturally high off the ground, their piercing gaze locked onto him. Slowly, a shape began to emerge from the darkness. It was massive, at least 8 feet tall, its body covered in matted fur that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. Its head was wolf-like, but its features were distorted, twisted. Long, sharp teeth glinted as its lips curled into a snarl. Clawed hands, not paws, gripped the bark of a nearby tree as it leaned forward, its glowing eyes never leaving Jake. "Oh, God," Jake whispered, fumbling for his radio.
"Dispatch, I think I found something. Over."
The creature let out a deafening roar, the sound reverberating through the forest. Jake barely had time to react before it lunged toward him. He fired his gun, the shots echoing like thunder, but the beast was too fast. It vanished into the shadows, leaving behind only the faint rustle of leaves. Jake's hands shook as he reloaded his weapon, his eyes darting around the forest.
Dispatch, I need backup. Now, there's something out here. It's not human. Over.
The radio crackled.
Jake, what are you
Then silence. The sun was beginning to set, casting an orange glow over the forest as Jake stumbled back toward the campsite. His mind raced, replaying the encounter over and over. What the hell was that thing? Was it following him? He couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, his every step accompanied by the faint sound of rustling leaves. When he finally reached the campsite, his relief was short-lived. The tent had been shredded, its fabric hanging in tatters. The sleeping bags were gone. A deep gouge had been carved into the ground, as though something massive had dragged its claws through the earth. And then he saw the blood. It was smeared across the trees, dark and glistening in the fading light. Jake's stomach churned as he followed the trail, his boots squelching in the damp soil. The trail led him to a small clearing where he stopped dead in his tracks. The father and daughter were there, or what was left of them. Jake's knees buckled and he fell to the ground, his stomach heaving. The bodies were torn apart, their limbs scattered like broken toys. The man's face was frozen in a grotesque mask of terror, his eyes wide and unseeing. A low growl rumbled behind him. Jake didn't have to turn around to know what it was. He could feel its presence, its breath hot against the back of his neck. He closed his eyes, gripping his gun tightly. "Not like this," he whispered. The growl grew louder, closer. Jake spun around, firing blindly, his shots lighting up the darkening forest. The creature roared, lunging at him with terrifying speed. Jake barely managed to dodge, the beast's claws slicing through the air where he'd just been. He ran. He didn't look back, didn't stop. The sound of heavy footsteps thundered behind him, the beast's guttural snarls echoing through the trees. His lungs burned, his legs screamed in protest, but he pushed on, driven by sheer survival instinct. Up ahead, he saw the glimmer of water. Medicine Lake. If he could just make it to the shore, maybe he could find a way to escape. He burst through the tree line, the lake stretching out before him like a lifeline. But the creature was faster. It tackled him from behind, slamming him into the ground. Jake screamed as the beast's claws raked across his back, tearing through his uniform and flesh. He twisted around, firing his gun point blank into its chest. The creature howled in pain, recoiling just enough for Jake to scramble to his feet and dive into the lake. The icy water shocked his system, stealing the breath from his lungs. He swam as hard as he could, his vision blurring from the pain and cold. Behind him, the beast paced along the shore, its glowing eyes watching him with predatory hunger. For now, he was safe, but he knew it wouldn't last. Jake's body trembled as he clung to a submerged tree trunk near the lake's edge. Cold water numbed his wounds, but his mind was on fire with panic. Every sound, the lapping of the waves, the faint rustle of the forest, felt amplified in the oppressive silence. He dared not move, his eyes fixed on the shoreline where the beast prowled. It stood there, silhouetted against the fading twilight, its massive frame tense and alert. The creature's one visible red eye glared into the water, scanning the ripples for any sign of its prey. Jake could see the ragged scar from his gunshot on its chest, but it didn't seem slowed by the injury. If anything, it seemed angrier, its growls rumbling like distant thunder. "Think, Jake. Think," he whispered to himself, his breath shallow and shaky. He couldn't stay in the lake forever. The icy water would claim him before the DOGMAN did. But climbing back to shore felt like a death sentence. The beast suddenly stopped pacing, its head snapping toward a cluster of bushes on the tree line. Jake's heart skipped a beat. He followed its gaze, squinting through the dim light. A rabbit emerged, its tiny body trembling as it hopped cautiously out of the underbrush. The dogman snarled and lunged. The rabbit didn't stand a chance. With a sickening crunch, the beast's jaws clamped down on its prey. Jake flinched, bile rising in his throat as he watched the creature shake the lifeless body like a rag doll. Blood dripped from its snout, staining the pristine snow beneath it. Jake used the distraction to inch farther along the water's edge. He moved slowly, his muscles screaming from the cold. Each tiny splash sounded deafening to his ears, but the beast remained focused on its kill. Finally, Jake reached a point where the shoreline curved, offering him a narrow path back into the forest. He hauled himself onto the bank, his drenched clothes weighing him down. His teeth chattered as he forced his legs to move, his boots squelching in the muddy ground. He needed to put as much distance as possible between himself and that monster. The forest was darker now, the last rays of sunlight swallowed by the thick canopy. Jake's flashlight flickered weakly, its beam barely cutting through the gloom. He had no idea where he was going. All that mattered was getting away. His radio was silent, its signal lost in the remote wilderness. He was completely alone, or so he thought. A branch snapped somewhere behind him. Jake froze, his heart pounding in his ears. He turned slowly, his flashlight trembling in his grasp. The forest stared back at him, silent and still, but he knew better. He knew it was out there, watching, waiting. "Come on," he muttered under his breath. "Keep it together." He pressed on, his pace quickening despite his exhaustion. Every shadow seemed alive. The forest felt like a living entity, conspiring to trap him in its depths. And then he heard it. It was low and guttural, resonating through the trees like a predator's warning. Jake's blood ran cold. He swung his flashlight wildly, the beam cutting through the darkness in frantic arcs. The growl came again, closer this time. "Stay back," Jake shouted, his voice cracking. He drew his handgun, gripping it tightly despite his trembling hands. The forest seemed to close in around him, the shadows growing deeper and more oppressive. A pair of glowing red eyes appeared in the distance. Jake fired. The muzzle flash lit up the trees, and the sound of the gunshot echoed like a cannon blast. The eyes vanished, but Jake didn't wait to see if his shot had landed. He turned and ran, his legs pumping with adrenaline-fueled desperation. The terrain grew rougher as Jake stumbled deeper into the forest. Rocks and roots threatened to trip him with every step, but he didn't dare slow down. He could hear the creature crashing through the underbrush behind him, its guttural snarls growing louder. Up ahead, Jake spotted a rocky outcrop rising above the trees. It wasn't much, but it was the only defensible position he'd seen in hours. He scrambled up the incline, his boots slipping on the loose gravel. When he reached the top, he turned to face the forest, his gun at the ready. The beast emerged from the shadows, its hulking form illuminated by the pale moonlight. It moved with a predatory grace, its muscles rippling beneath its matted fur. Blood still dripped from its maw, and its single red eye burned with unrelenting hatred. "Come on, you bastard," Jake muttered, his voice a mix of fear and defiance. He fired again, the bullets striking the creature's chest. It staggered, but didn't fall. Instead, it roared in fury, the sound shaking into his core. The dogman charged, its claws digging into the rocky slope as it climbed toward him. Jake backed up, his mind racing. He couldn't outrun it, and his bullets were barely slowing it down. He needed another plan. His eyes darted around the outcrop, searching for anything he could use. Then he saw it, a large, jagged boulder perched precariously near the edge. If he could time it right. The beast lunged at him, its claws swiping inches from his face. Jake dove to the side, rolling to his feet and sprinting toward the boulder. He braced himself against it and pushed with all his might. The rock shifted, teetered, and then crashed down the slope. The dogman had no time to react. The boulder struck it with a sickening crunch, sending it tumbling back into the forest. Jake collapsed to his knees, gasping for breath. For a moment, all was silent. But he knew it wasn't over. Jake didn't wait to see if the creature would rise again. He descended the outcrop on the opposite side, his legs shaking with exhaustion. He needed to find shelter, somewhere he could regroup and tend to his wounds. As he stumbled through the forest, he spotted a roof of an old abandoned cabin in the distance. His heart leapt. He forced his legs to move faster, his hope outweighing his fear. Its windows were broken, and the door hung loosely on its hinges, but it was better than nothing. Jake stepped inside, his flashlight illuminating the dusty interior. The cabin was small, with a single room containing a rusted stove, a rickety table, and a moth-eaten cot. He barricaded the door with a broken chair and collapsed onto the cot, his body screaming in protest. His wounds throbbed, and his head felt light from blood loss, but he couldn't afford to rest for long. The dogman was still out there. Jake checked his gun. 4 bullets left. It wasn't enough. He glanced around the cabin, searching for anything that could be used as a weapon. His eyes landed on a rusty hatchet lying in the corner. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. As he gripped the hatchet, the faint sound of footsteps reached his ears. They were slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. Jake's breath caught in his throat. The creature had found him. A low growl resonated outside, followed by the sound of claws scraping against the wooden walls. Jake tightened his grip on the hatchet, his knuckles white. He knew this would be his last stand. The dogman let out a roar, and the cabin's fragile door splintered under its weight. Jake's heart thundered in his chest as the dogman's claws splintered the door. Shards of wood rained down as the beast shoved its massive frame through the opening. Its glowing red eye locked onto him. It crouched low, snarling, saliva dripping from its fangs. "Come on, you bastard," Jake growled, gripping the rusty hatchet in one hand and his gun in the other. His legs screamed in protest as he stood, his body battered and weak from the relentless chase. The dogman lunged. Jake dove to the side, the beast's claws swiping inches from his head. It crashed into the rickety table, shattering it into splinters. Jake scrambled to his feet, his back pressing against the cabin wall. He fired twice, the bullets striking the creature's shoulder and chest. The dogman howled in pain but kept advancing, its snarls more feral than ever. Jake swung the hatchet as the beast lunged again. The blade bit into its arm, and it recoiled, letting out a deafening roar. Blood sprayed across the cabin floor, but the dogman barely seemed to notice. It lashed out with its other arm, claws raking across Jake's torso. He cried out, the pain blinding as he stumbled back into the corner of the room. The beast loomed over him, its hot breath washing over his face. Its snarls echoed in the small cabin, drowning out the pounding of his own heart. Jake gritted his teeth and thrust the hatchet upward, aiming for its neck. The blade sank deep into flesh, and the dogman reared back, howling in rage and agony. Jake seized the moment. He scrambled past the beast, grabbing the remains of the broken chair. With every ounce of strength he had left, he swung the chair leg, smashing it into the side of the dogman's head. The beast staggered, dazed but far from defeated. "Stay down, damn you," Jake shouted, his voice hoarse. The dogman's one glowing eye focused on him, its lips pulling back in a twisted grin. It lunged again, faster than Jake expected. Its claws caught him across the shoulder, sending him sprawling to the floor. The gun skittered out of his hand, disappearing beneath the broken cot. Jake's vision blurred as he crawled towards the cot, his fingers scrabbling at the floorboards. The dogman's growls grew louder, closer. He reached under the cot, his hand brushing against cold metal. Gripping the gun, he rolled onto his back just as the beast pounced. The shot echoed. The bullet struck the dogman square in its mutilated eye, and it let out a blood-curdling scream. The creature thrashed wildly, its claws tearing into the walls and floor as it writhed in pain. Jake scrambled to his feet, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The dogman's movement slowed, its growls fading into low, guttural whimpers. It collapsed onto the floor, its massive body heaving with labored breaths. Jake stared at it, his chest rising and falling in sync with the creature's dying gasps. For a moment, he thought it was over, but then its head snapped up, its remaining eye locking onto him with an intensity that sent a chill down his spine. It wasn't finished. The dogman rose to its feet, staggering but still deadly. Jake backed toward the open door, his mind racing. He was out of bullets, and the hatchet was buried in the creature's arm. He needed a plan fast. His eyes darted around the cabin, landing on the rusted stove. An idea sparked. He darted toward it, yanking open the creaking door. Inside, a few scraps of firewood sat among a pile of ash. Jake grabbed the wood and threw it at the dogman, buying himself precious seconds as the beast swatted the projectiles away. He tore the gas line from the back of the stove, the faint hiss of escaping gas filling the air. Jake grabbed a matchbox from the counter, his hands shaking as he struck a match. The tiny flame flickered, casting shadows across the cabin. "Come on, you son of a bitch," Jake muttered, backing toward the door. The dogman advanced, its growls growing louder, more feral. Jake lit another match and tossed it toward the stove. The explosion rocked the cabin, a fireball engulfing the beast as Jake dove out the door. He hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the wind out of him. Flames roared behind him, the heat searing his skin as the cabin was consumed. Jake crawled to his feet, stumbling away from the inferno. His body ached, his wounds screaming in protest, but he didn't stop. He didn't look back. The howls of the dogman echoed through the flames, growing fainter with each passing second. When he finally collapsed, it was beneath the open sky. The stars above seemed distant and cold, offering no comfort. Jake lay there, his chest heaving, as the adrenaline began to fade. The forest was silence once more, the oppressive stillness returning. Morning came slowly, the first rays of sunlight piercing through the trees. Jake awoke to the sound of birds singing, a stark contrast to the horrors of the night before. His body felt like it had been through a meat grinder, every movement sending jolts of pain through him. He sat up, his gaze falling on the smoldering ruins of the cabin in the distance. Smoke curled into the sky, a grim reminder of what had transpired. Jake's mind raced as he replayed the events, trying to make sense of it all. The dogman was dead. It had to be. No creature could survive that inferno. But the thought did little to ease his nerves. He'd seen what it was capable of, and he knew there was more to fear in those woods than he'd ever imagined. A faint rustling in the underbrush snapped him out of his thoughts. Jake's hand instinctively went to his hip, but his gun was gone. He stood slowly, his eyes scanning the tree line. "Who's there?" he called, his voice hoarse. The rustling grew louder, closer. Jake tensed, his fists clenching at his sides. And then a figure emerged. It was a man, his face pale and drawn. He wore a ranger uniform, but it was tattered and stained with blood. His eyes were wide, filled with a mixture of fear and relief. "Jake?" the man croaked. "Thank God. I thought I was the only one left. Jake stared at him, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. Who are you? Ranger Matthews, the man said, taking a shaky step forward. I was part of the search team sent out yesterday. We heard the screams. We didn't know what to do. We thought... He trailed off, his eyes darting toward the smoldering ruins of the cabin. Jake's stomach twisted. What happened to the rest of your team? Matthews shook his head, his expression haunted. Gone. All of them. That thing, it tore them apart. I barely got away. Jake's blood ran cold. He stepped forward, gripping Matthews by the shoulders. Listen to me. We need to get out of here. Now. Matthews nodded, his hands trembling. There's a station a few miles from here. We can radio for help. Together, they set off into the forest, the morning light offering little comfort. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, the shadows seeming to shift with every step. He glanced back one last time at the ruins of the cabin, his jaw tightening. The nightmare wasn't over. Jake and Ranger Matthews moved cautiously through the dense forest, their steps muffled by the soft carpet of pine needles. The early morning light trickled through the canopy, casting shifting shadows that played tricks on the eyes. Every crackle of a twig or rustle of leaves sent their nerves into overdrive, the lingering fear of the DOGMAN keeping them on edge. Matthews walked a few steps behind Jake, his gaze darting nervously to the trees around them. Jake, are you sure it's dead? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jake didn't look back. It has to be. That cabin went up like a bonfire. Nothing could have survived that. Matthews hesitated. Yeah, but what if there's more than one? Jake's jaw tightened. The thought had crossed his mind, but he couldn't afford to dwell on it. Then we keep moving. We get to the station, call for help, and get the hell out of here. The two trudged on in silence, the forest seeming to close in around them. Jake's body ached, every step a reminder of his earlier battle. He clutched the rusty hatchet tightly in his hand, the weight of it both comforting and ominous. After an hour of walking, they came to a clearing where a narrow stream cut through the forest. Jake knelt by the water, splashing his face and drinking deeply. Matthews joined him, his hands trembling as he cupped the cold water to his lips. How far is the station? Jake asked, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. Matthews glanced up, his brow furrowed in thought. Another couple of miles, maybe less. If we stay on this course, we... A distant howl cut him off. Both men froze, their eyes meeting in silent understanding. It wasn't the mournful cry of a wolf or the echo of the wind through the trees. It was something deeper, more guttural, and it was getting closer. Move, Jake said, his voice firm. He stood, grabbing Matthews by the arm and pulling him to his feet. They crossed the stream and plunged back into the forest, their pace quickening with every step. The howls grew louder, joined by the sound of something crashing through the underbrush. Jake's mind raced. The dogman he'd fought was massive, but the sheer force of the sounds behind them suggested something even larger. Matthews, do you have a weapon? Jake asked, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Matthews shook his head, panic etched across his face. I only have 5 rounds left in my revolver. It won't do much to that monster. I barely got away. Jake cursed under his breath. Just stay close. A tree ahead of them exploded into splinters, the massive trunk crashing to the ground. Jake skidded to a halt, throwing his arm out to stop Matthews. Standing in the shattered remains of the tree was another dogman, even larger than the first. Its fur was darker, almost black, and its eyes burned with a malevolent red glow. It roared, the sound shaking the very ground beneath their feet. Jake raised the hatchet, knowing it was a feeble defense against such a creature. "Run!" he shouted, shoving Matthews toward the tree line. The beast lunged, its claws swiping at Jake. He dove to the side, the hatchet slipping from his grasp as he hit the ground. The dogman's claws raked the earth where he'd been standing, leaving deep gouges in the soil. Jake scrambled to his feet, grabbing a fallen branch as the creature advanced. He swung it with all his strength, the wood shattering uselessly against the dogman's chest. The beast snarled and swatted him aside like a rag doll, sending him crashing into a tree. Pain flared through Jake's body, but he forced himself to move. He crawled toward the hatchet, his fingers brushing the handle just as the dogman loomed over him. It raised a massive claw, ready to strike. A sudden burst of gunfire echoed through the forest, staggering back as blood sprayed from its side. Jake turned to see Matthews standing a few feet away, his revolver clutched in his shaking hands. "Jake, get the fuck up," Matthews said, his voice trembling. He aimed his revolver and shot again, the blast tearing into the dogman's shoulder. "Jake, get up." Jake didn't need to be told twice. He grabbed the hatchet and scrambled to his feet, his vision swimming from the impact of the tree. The dogman snarled, its attention now focused on Matthews. It charged, its claws outstretched. "Move!" Jake shouted. Matthews dove to the side, firing one last shot as the dogman closed the distance. The blast struck its leg, sending it crashing to the ground. Jake seized the opportunity. He leapt onto the beast's back, driving the hatchet into the base of its neck. The dogman howled, thrashing violently as blood poured from the wound. Jake held on, his hands slick with the creature's blood, and drove the hatchet deeper. With a final, ear-splitting roar, the dogman collapsed. Jake rolled off its massive body, gasping for breath as he lay on the ground. Matthews staggered over. Is it dead?" Matthews asked, his voice barely audible. Jake pushed himself up, his body trembling. He stared at the lifeless form of the dogman, its red eyes now dull and lifeless. "Yeah," he said, his voice hollow. "It's dead." The two men didn't linger. They knew the other howls they'd heard earlier were no illusion. There were more of these things out there, and they were running out of time. They moved as quickly as their battered bodies would allow. The forest seemed darker now, the oppressive silence broken only by the distant howls of the remaining dogmen. "How much farther?" Jake asked, his voice strained. Matthews pointed ahead. "The station should be just over that ridge. If we can make it there, we can lock ourselves in and call for backup." Jake nodded, his resolve hardening. They climbed the ridge, their breaths coming in short gasps. When they reached the top, they saw it. The ranger station, a small building nestled among the trees, its windows glowing faintly in the early morning light. Relief washed over Anne, but it was short-lived. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed behind them, accompanied by guttural growls. Jake turned, his blood running cold. 3 more dogmen emerged from the shadows, their eyes glowing with predatory intent. "Run!" Jake shouted, grabbing Matthews by the arm and pulling him toward the station. The 2 men sprinted down the ridge, the ground uneven beneath their feet. The dogmen gave chase, their snarls growing louder with each passing second. They reached the station just as the first dogman lunged. Jake shoved Matthews through the door, slamming it shut and throwing the bolt. The beast's claws raked against the wood, the door shaking under the force of its blows. Inside, the station was cramped but secure. Jake and Matthews backed away from the door, their weapons at the ready. The radio crackled to life on the desk, the voice of a dispatcher cutting through the static.
"Ranger Matthews, this is dispatch. Do you copy?
Matthews lunged for the radio, his voice desperate.
This is Matthews. We need immediate assistance at the station near Medicine Lake. There are creatures out here. They've killed people. Send help now.
The dispatcher hesitated.
Creatures? Matthews, are you saying?
The door splintered under another heavy blow, and Jake fired his shotgun through the crack. The growls outside grew louder, more frenzied.
Just send help,
Matthews screamed. The ranger station groaned as the dogmen hammered against its walls, their guttural snarls vibrating through the room. Jake and Matthews stood back to back, their weapons at the ready, each man drenched in sweat despite the morning chill. The single radio continued to crackle on the desk, but no response came from dispatch. The door shuddered as another heavy blow landed, the wood splintering further. "They're not going to stop," Matthews muttered, his voice trembling. "We have to hold them off long enough for help to get here, if help's even coming." Another crash sent a wooden plank flying from the doorframe, revealing a sliver of a massive clawed hand. Matthews let out a strangled gasp and stumbled back. "Focus," Jake snapped. Jake looked over to the gun locker behind the reception area. He smashed the lock with his hatchet, grabbed the shotgun and loaded some slugs into it. He fired through the gap, the shotgun blast reverberating in the small space. A howl of pain followed, and the hand withdrew, but the assault didn't let up. From outside, the dogman's guttural growls turned into howls, a haunting chorus that seemed to echo across the forest. Ian's stomach sank as he realized what they were doing. "They're calling for more," he whispered. Matthew's face went pale. "More? You mean there's even more of these things?" Jake didn't answer. He couldn't afford to entertain the thought for too long. Instead, he grabbed a nearby chair and shoved it under the broken door handle, reinforcing the barricade. He motioned for Matthews to do the same with the small desk. Together, they pushed the desk against the door as the dogmen outside intensified their attack. Claws raked across the wooden siding, and heavy bodies slammed into the walls. "Check the windows," Jake ordered, his voice hoarse. Matthews nodded and ran to the far side of the station, peering through the glass. "They're circling us," Matthews said, his voice barely above a whisper. "3 of them, maybe 4. I can't tell, they're too fast," Jake swore under his breath. He couldn't see any way out of this. If backup didn't arrive soon, the station and their lives would be torn apart. The radio crackled again, and this time a voice came through, faint but audible.
Ranger Matthews, this is dispatch. Reinforcements are on the way. Hold your position. They'll be there in 20 minutes. Over.
Matthews grabbed the radio like a lifeline.
Copy that. We're under attack. These things are trying to break in. Hurry.
Jake's grip on the shotgun tightened. 20 minutes is a long time, he muttered. Too long, Matthews agreed, his voice shaking. The next attack came from the roof. The sound of heavy footsteps thudded overhead, and Jake looked up just in time to see a clawed hand smash through one of the skylights. Shards of glass rained down as a dogman tried to force its way through the narrow opening. Jake didn't hesitate. He raised the shotgun and fired, the blast tearing through the creature's arm. It howled in rage, pulling back as blood dripped from the shattered skylight. Another dogman leapt onto the roof, its claws scraping against the tin as it looked for another way inside. "They're going to find a way in," Matthew said, panic creeping into his voice. "We need a plan, Jake. Now." Jake's mind raced. He scanned the room, his eyes landing on the propane tank near the small stove in the corner. It was risky, but it might be their only shot. "The propane," Jake said, pointing. "If we can lure them inside, we can blow it. Take those bastards out all at once." Matthew stared at him, horrified. Blow it? Are you fucking insane? We're inside this place too. Do you have a better idea? Jake snapped. Matthews hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. What do we do? Jake grabbed the propane tank and placed it in the center of the room. He rummaged through the emergency supplies until he found a flare. When they break through, we fall back to the far corner, Jake explained. Let them come to us. Once they're close enough, I'll light the flare and toss it at the tank. Matthews swallowed hard. And what if the blast doesn't kill them? Then we make sure we die fighting. The door gave way first. The dogmen crashed through the barricade, their massive frames forcing their way inside. Their glowing red eyes scanned the room, locking onto the two men. Jake and Matthews retreated to the corner, as planned, their weapons raised. Come on, Jake muttered under his breath. Come closer. The lead dogman snarled and advanced, its claws clicking against the wooden floor. The others followed, their growls reverberating through the station. Jake's hand tightened around the flare, his heart pounding in his chest. When the first dogman was only a few feet from the propane tank, Jake struck the flare. The bright red flame hissed to life, and he hurled it toward the tank. Get down, he shouted, grabbing Matthews and diving behind the overturned desk. The explosion was deafening. The blast tore through the station, a fireball engulfing the dogman and consuming everything in its path. Jake felt the heat sear his skin as he and Matthews were thrown against the wall. The building shook, and the air filled with the acrid smell of burning wood and flesh. For a moment, there was only silence. Jake groaned as he pushed himself to his feet, his ears ringing. The station was in ruins, the walls charred, and the roof partially caved in. Flames crackled around him, casting eerie shadows on the remains of the room. Matthews, he called, coughing on the thick smoke. You alive? A pained groan answered him. Jake stumbled over to where Matthews lay, pinned under a fallen beam. He heaved the beam aside and helped the ranger to his feet. Did it work? Matthews asked, his voice weak. The bodies of the dogmen lay scattered across the floor, their charred forms still and lifeless. He nodded. Yeah, it worked. But as they made their way out of the wreckage, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was still watching. The silence outside was too complete, too unnatural. The morning sun cast an eerie glow over the scorched ruins of the ranger station. Smoke curled into the sky, and the acrid smell of burned wood and flesh lingered in the crisp air. Jake and Matthews staggered through the debris, their faces smeared with soot and their bodies battered but alive. If any more of those things show up, we're dead. Matthews nodded weakly, clutching his side where a shard of wood had grazed him during the explosion. You're one tough son of a bitch, Jake. Jake forced a chuckle, tears streaming down his face. Yeah, well, you're not so bad yourself. The sound of approaching helicopters broke through the stillness, their blades chopping through the air. Jake looked up, relief flooding through him as he saw the search and rescue team descending toward the tower. We're going to make it, Jake said, gripping Matthew's hand. Just hold on. Matthews nodded weakly, his eyes closing as the rescue team's voices echoed around them. Jake leaned back, his body finally succumbing to exhaustion as he watched the rising sun paint the forest in hues of gold and red. The nightmare was over, or so he hoped. If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to like and subscribe to Descent into the Unknown for more horror content. If you have any real cryptid encounters, or you're a horror writer wanting to share your stories, please feel free to email me in the description anytime.